to imagine something with me for a moment. Not something dramatic with explosions or sirens, but something quieter, something more unsettling. I want you to imagine waking up one morning and your phone isn't working the way it should. Your apps won't load, your bank accounts refresh, your messages won't send. At first, you think it's just a glitch. Maybe your Wi Fi is down. Maybe the network is slow. But then you step outside and you realize it's not just you. The gas stations aren't processing payments, stores are turning people away, and the ATMs are offline. And then suddenly, what felt like a minor inconvenience starts to feel like something much bigger. That's where this conversation begins because what I'm describing isn't science fiction. It is very real, and the vulnerability built into the way our society operates today. I've been looking deeper into this idea and what I call an invisible front line. And what we've come to understand is that the modern American doesn't run on physical infrastructure like roads, bridges. It runs on the data. Everything we do from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep is connected to digital systems that most of us never even think about. But when I check my phone, when I transfer money, and when I buy groceries, when trucks deliver supplies across the country, all of that is being managed, tracked, and processed through massive networks of data centers. Now, these facilities, they do operate by companies like Amazon, Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and, Google Cloud, which are essentially the backbone of our entire digital economy. They don't just store the information, they actively power the systems that keep the society functioning. And what really stands out to me is how invisible all of this is to the average person. Most people don't think about where their data lives or how it moves. We just expect everything to work. We expect instant access, instant communication, and instant transactions. That expectation has become so deeply embedded in our daily lives that we don't even question it anymore. But when I step back and I really analyze it, I start to see just how fragile the system actually is. Because all of that convenience depends on one constant, uninterrupted flow of data. And if that flow is disrupted, even temporarily, the effects don't stay confined to the digital world. They spill out into the real world very quickly. We've already seen, for examples of this, and one of the most important cases that really opened my eyes was the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack in 2021. Now, this wasn't an attack that really, or it wasn't the attack that physically destroyed anything, but it controlled fuel disruption, and what happened as a result, the pipeline shut down. As a precaution, and within days, we saw fuel shortages across the East Coast, and people started lining up at gas stations and panicking, buying fuel, filling containers, and prices began to spike. What's critical to understand here is that the panic didn't come from a total collapse. It came from the uncertainty. People didn't know how long the disruption would last, and what uncertainty triggered that chain of reaction of the behavior that made the situation much worse. That's the part that I think a lot of people underestimate. When we talk about cyber attacks, we tend to focus on the technical side, the hacking the systems, the code. But what really matters is the human response, because once people start to lose confidence in the systems they rely on, that's when things begin to spiral. And when I look at the broader landscape, I see that the threat isn't just isolated incidents like Colonial Pipeline agencies, like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security agencies, and the National Security Agency. Having been warning for years that the critical infrastructure, including energy, financial, healthcare, and communications as a prime target for cyber attacks. These aren't hypothetical concerns, they're documented risks backed by ongoing threat assessments and real world incidents. When I start connecting the dots, I realize that the real danger isn't just one system going down, it's multiple systems being disrupted at the same time. Excuse me. Let's imagine a scenario where financial networks are compromised, telecommunications are unstable, and the cloud services are partially offline. Suddenly, you're dealing with a situation where people don't access their money, businesses can't process their transactions, and supply chains lose the visibility and communication becomes unreliable. This is not just an inconvenience, that's a systemic shock, and in high interconnected societies like ours, those shocks don't stay isolated, they cascade. And another layer of this I think is important to talk about is the rise of the global cyber attacks. When we look at the capabilities that exist today, it's clear that cyber warfare has become a major component of geopolitical strategy. Countries like Russia and China have been widely reported in cybersecurity analysis as having every incident is tied to a nation state, but it doesn't mean that the tools and expertise required to carry out the large-scale cyber attacks are very real or very developed. And what's even more concerning is that many of these operations aren't about the immediate disruptions, they're about access. Gaming entry into systems and mapping out networks and identifying the vulnerabilities and positioning themselves for the potential for future use. That idea that threats can exist quietly within the systems without without immediate detection is something that I think should get more attention with other people. Because if an attack were to happen on a large scale, it likely wouldn't come out of nowhere. It would be the result of groundwork that had been laid over time, and when I think about how interconnected the systems are, I started to see how even a limited disruption could spread. Data centers are designed with the redundancy, with backup power and multiple connections and geographic distribution, but they're still part of a network, and the networks by their nature can propagate failures if the certain critical points are affected. What also stands out to me is the concentration of infrastructure, which is a significant portion of global cloud services, is handled by a relatively small number of providers. That creates an efficiency, but it also creates central points of dependency. If one of those major platforms experiences a disruption, it doesn't just affect one company, it affects thousands of services that rely on it. And what we're at risk about is the multiples, or it multiplies. And it's not about the single failure, it's about the ripple effects across entire sectors. Now, to be clear, there are efforts in place to address these risks, and the organizations like the National Institute of Standards and Technology have developed cybersecurity frameworks that guide best practices. And both government agencies and private companies invest heavily in security measures, but the reality is that the cybersecurity is constantly evolving. It's not something you solve once and move on from. It's an ongoing process of adapting to new threats, new techniques, and new vulnerabilities. And because much of the process of adapting the new threats to new techniques and new vulnerabilities, much of the infrastructure is privately owned, and coordination between different entities, which becomes a challenge in and of itself. One thing I keep going back to as I think about all of this is the psychological impacts. Because at the end of the day, the biggest risk isn't just the technical disruption, it's how people react to it. We live in a system that depends on trust, and trust that's our money is that we trust our money is accessible, that our communications will work, and that our information we receive is accurate and correct. When that trust is shaken, however, even temporarily, the effects can be immediate. People start to question what's real and what's functioning and what's safe. And in that environment, misinformation can spread rapidly, especially if communication platforms are compromised or unreliable. So when I look at the idea of the invisible front line, I don't just see data centers and servers. I see a system of dependencies that most of us rely on without the full understanding. However, I see a society that has become incredibly efficient, but also incredibly interconnected. And I see a threat landscape that is constantly evolving where the lines between physical and digital conflict are becoming increasingly blurred. What this all comes down to is in my view, is a preparedness, not just of the institutional level, but at the societal level. Because the question isn't whether disruptions will happen. We've already seen that they can, and they do. The real question is how we respond when they do. Do we have systems in place to communicate clearly with the public? Or do we have redundancies that can keep critical services running? And maybe most importantly, do people understand the risk well enough to respond calmly instead of reactively? As I think about the future, it's clear to me that the cybersecurity isn't just a technical issue, it is a foundational issue for how modern societies operate. The more we rely on the digital systems, the more important it becomes to understand both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. And while it's easy to focus on worst case scenarios, I think more productive approach is awareness. Understanding how these systems work and recognizing the potential risk and having the realistic expectations about what could happen in a disruption. If there's one thing that stands out to me after looking at all of this, it's that most dangerous part of cyber crises isn't necessarily the attack itself, it's uncertainty that follows. And how we handle that uncertainty, both as individuals and as a society, will ultimately determine whether a disruption remains manageable or it turns into something far more serious. So when I talk about the invisible front line, I'm not trying to create fear. I'm not trying to highlight something that's already exists. A layer of modern life that most of us don't see, but all of us depend on. And if that layer is ever significantly disrupted, even for a short period of time, the effects will be felt far beyond the digital world. They'll be felt in our economy, our communities, and our daily lives. And that's why this conversation matters, because understanding this system is the first step toward being prepared for when it doesn't work the way we expect it to. If you found this information helpful and you would like to dig more into it, please let me know. And I want to thank you once again for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens podcast. And as always, we'll see you in the next video. Peace.